So here's the thing. As a whole, the human race is a very resilient species. And when disaster strikes, we often just want to rebuild. But what happens when we can't? Today we're going to look at some disaster zones that are like scars on our planet that will never fully heal. So if you ask anyone to name an abandoned place, they're likely to mention the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the nearby city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine. Before the Chernobyl meltdown, Pripyat was a relatively advanced Soviet city built to house and support nuclear power plant workers. You likely know what happened next. On April 27, 1986, authorities began evacuating all 115,000 citizens of Pripyat 36 hours after a series of explosions sent radiation spewing into the area.
People were told that they are leaving only for 3 days, but they never came back.
A grim cover-up followed, and the 19-mile surrounding area remains uninhabitable decades later. The Chernobyl exclusion zone is now a marshy, forested region full of abandoned property that has remained relatively free from human activity since its condemnation. It's against the law to live within the zone, though at least 100 people still work their land as subsistence farmers. In the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a number of Ukrainian citizens took to living just outside the border to avoid conflict and take advantage of the cheap real estate. One such resident told the BBC, "I don't care about the radiation. I only care that there are no shells flying over my children." Centralia, Pennsylvania was one of the nicer places for a coal miner to live in 19th century America. An anthracite coal mining town, if you don't know what that means, just hang on a sec. Centralia even weathered the Great Depression without shutting down. Then, in 1962, the city council decided to deal with an abandoned mine that had been turned into a garbage dump. They set fire to the landfill, which ignited a blaze in an underground coal seam that has burned uninterrupted to this day and is expected to continue burning for the next 250 years. Which makes you wonder, no one thought it was a bad idea to just set the problem on fire?
Foundations, yet no houses. A police station, but no police force. A settlement that has vanished.
The fire under Centralia spits smoke out every available crack, cloaking the town in a thick white cloud. The roads can reach temperatures above 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and there are sinkholes that lead directly to pits full of fire.
There's cracks visible, there's steam coming up out of the ground. It seems like some kind of a volcanic wasteland.
Every attempt to put out the blaze has failed, and by the turn of the 20th century, nobody could tell which mines were in flames. It could have been all of them.
The mine fire heated 8,000 gallons of gasoline at John Coddington's service station to near boiling point.
In 1992, Pennsylvania condemned the city's buildings and eliminated the zip code in an effort to force its few remaining inhabitants to leave the burning city. As of the 2020 census, 5 stubborn residents continued to call Centralia home. So remember that word anthracite? Turns out it means it's coal high in carbon, and dumping trash on it only helped keep that coal burning. Oh, and it's a dirty burn, so it's super bad for the environment. As it goes with many mining towns, Wittenoom, Australia was gradually destroyed by the natural resource its economy was based on. Around 1915, a form of blue asbestos called crocidolite was discovered in the Hamersley Ranges of Pilbara in Western Australia. By 1925, miners were flocking to the area eager to cash in, only to lose their claims to a corporate milling operation, which itself was then bought out. From 1943 to 1966, a company called Colonial Sugar Refinery mined all the asbestos in the Wittenoom area, but when it became unprofitable, they shut down the operation. Unfortunately, crocidolite is exceptionally dangerous, and the entire Wittenoom area is now the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere.
I think even a lot of the miners at the time weren't aware how dangerous it was.
In 2007, the Western Australian government removed Wittenoom from the map to deter curious visitors, even though that kind of makes the place all the more intriguing. The surrounding area is full of asbestos tailings, which is a hazardous material that can cause mesothelioma. In 2022, Parliament passed a bill that condemned the area and set to work demolishing the remaining buildings. But they did nothing to clean up the remaining contaminants, leaving anyone nearby vulnerable to very aggressive cancer.
The people are gone, but it's estimated 3 million tonnes of asbestos tailings remain.
This enraged the local indigenous population, who continue to ask the government to clean up the deadly asbestos that industry left behind.
We'd like to see our country rehabbed and be safe for us to get back in again.
Villa Epecuén was established in 1921 as a tourist attraction in Argentina's beautiful Buenos Aires province. The main attraction was Lago Epecuén, a natural salt lake with rumored healing properties that attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors. The health tourism business spawned a town with 1,500 permanent residents, 5,000 hotel beds, and as many as 25,000 tourists in its most popular summers. Then, on November 10, 1985, the shoddy earthen dam that guarded Villa Epecuén collapsed, submerging the town, and the floodwaters didn't subside. In fact, they deepened to over 30 feet by 1993. Even so, Villa Epecuén remained a tourist attraction during its underwater era, with curious onlookers traveling there to see the unique sights. Though it took over 2 decades, the waters eventually receded into the lake, revealing what was left of the once thriving town. After the waters cleared, a single former resident moved back to live there, which, what was he doing for those 20 years? Checking his watch? Just waiting right off screen? We might never know. In 2024, that lone resident passed away, leaving Villa Epecuén a ghost town once again. Craco is a medieval village that sits atop a 1,300-foot cliff in the Basilicata region of southern Italy. 6th century Greek monks were the first known inhabitants of the area, but Craco got its name from its 11th century owner. Craco, population over 2,500, had a university, a very influential church, and a towering castle with a built-in prison. In the 17th century, Craco was hit hard by a plague, and brigands were a problem in the 19th century. But the medieval town managed to survive well into the 1900s.
While the medieval site is built on solid rock, the new town sits on less stable ground, and new infrastructure works were putting ever greater pressure on this unstable ground.
A series of devastating landslides between 1959 and 1972 gradually annihilated many of the structures in Craco. Given Craco's mountainous terrain, earthquakes consistently triggered rock slides. In 1963, the Italian government moved the 1,800 remaining residents out of Craco and into a new settlement to avoid further casualties. While no one lives in Craco anymore, the site remains a popular stop for tourists who want to check out the glorious architecture that still remains. Guided tours allow visitors to take in the abandoned beauty of the area, but even more people have seen Craco in feature films. Movies like The Passion of the Christ have included footage shot in the area, which should give you a sense of the place's mystical feel. Second only to Chernobyl, the Fukushima Daiichi power plant meltdown is one of the most well-known nuclear disasters of all time. On March 11, 2011, a 9.0 earthquake sent a massive tsunami onto the eastern shores of Honshu Island.
The earthquake that shook the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was the most powerful to strike Japan since records began.
Destruction from the quake caused a cooling failure at the plant and the flood of nuclear materials into the region.
The company had never imagined they might have to vent a reactor without electricity. They didn't know how to do it.
The evacuation of the surrounding area was gradual, initially focusing on a 1.2-mile radius before expanding to 12 miles. Many of these areas remain mostly or entirely uninhabited today. The town of Futaba, Fukushima is a tragic example of the aftermath of the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown. Futaba had around 7,100 permanent residents before 2011, but the Japanese government enacted an 11-year evacuation order as authorities worked to clean up the disaster.
Vast amounts of waste like contaminated water and soils being created, and where to store it is still an ongoing issue.
In 2022, the evacuation order was lifted and residents were allowed to return. Most decided against it, however, leading Futaba to set a goal of moving 2,000 people into the district by 2030. It could take decades for Futaba and its neighboring areas to return to anything approaching their pre-2011 population numbers. Thistle, Utah sits about 67 miles south of Salt Lake City in the Spanish Fork Canyon. It came to be in the late 19th century as a small farming and ranching community at the meeting point of 3 important railroad lines. Roughly 600 people lived in Thistle by 1917. Then things took a downward turn as passing trains became less and less frequent over the decades. By the end of the 1970s, most of the town's businesses had shut down, and the remaining population numbered around 50. Then came the fatal blow. In 1983, after a period of unusually heavy rainfall and late snow, a massive landslide sent piles of rocks into 2 creeks near Thistle, forming a natural dam that set off a tremendous flood. The town was reduced to a bunch of discarded roofs and half-standing foundations. Most of what used to be Thistle sits unoccupied and abandoned. In 2018, a lightning storm caused a fire that burned up a considerable amount of Thistle's remaining buildings. Only a few industrial structures and half-submerged houses still exist in the area. Plymouth, Montserrat might have one of the biggest falls from grace of any abandoned locale. It's a capital city of the tiny British island territory, and it was once one of the most lavish vacation destinations on Earth. In fact, the northern half of the island is covered in lush jungles and beautiful beaches to this day. Celebrity guests used to enjoy a wide variety of exclusive entertainment options at the high-class Montserrat Springs Hotel, and a nearby recording studio once hosted Paul McCartney and the Rolling Stones. That reputation for tourism faded after a series of devastating volcanic eruptions in the late 1990s.
So you can't outrun it, and it kills you if it touches you.
In 1995, the Soufriere Hills volcano began to emit smoke after lying dormant for several centuries. Just over a year later, the mountain erupted, sending a torrent of lava and pyroclastic ash onto nearby villages.
There was a cloud of black ash just blanked out the whole place, and the place became very dark.
In the summer of 1997, a particularly violent burst buried most of Plymouth in mud and ash, ending the tourism economy. A considerable percentage of Montserrat's south sits in an exclusion zone, which strictly regulates all movement based on volcanic activity in the area at any given time. Some bold explorers still tour Plymouth, taking in the sights of a ruined paradise. The people of Attu, Alaska weren't displaced by a natural disaster or a fateful mistake. They were literally stolen by an invading army. Attu is the westernmost landmass of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. Its indigenous population were the Aleut people, of whom there were only around 1,000. Their most populous village held less than 300 residents in its heyday. During World War II, Attu became a tactically important target for both American and Japanese forces. The Japanese soldiers took Attu without resistance, but when they eventually left the island, they took the remaining 42 residents with them. Later, American forces retook Attu in a bloody battle. In Japan, the small population of Attu experienced violence and internment as prisoners of war. 22 of them died.
42 Attuans relocated to Japan, where almost half of them died from not being fed properly.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Army burned their villages to the ground to prevent the Japanese from using them. When the U.S. returned the Attuans to their homeland, they relocated them to a radically different region of Alaska, leaving their homes abandoned. The first indigenous Aleutian people to step on Attu since World War II reached the island in 2017 after a 2-day trip aboard a research vessel. The island lacks facilities to accommodate visits lasting longer than a few hours, but there still is a chance to rebuild one day. Gilman, Colorado was once a mining town south of Vail and northeast of Aspen. The area was part of the Great Silver Boom in 1879, resulting in the establishment of Gilman, population 1,500, a few years later. The town was home to multiple hotels, an opera house, and a local newspaper. In 1900, a massive fire consumed many of these businesses, but it didn't stop Gilman. But even as the small town continued to thrive, the effects of their main export endangered its citizens. Heavy metals contaminated the water, groundwater, and soil over the decades of mining, wiping out much of the local ecosystem and forcing the government to intervene. In 1986, the EPA declared Gilman part of the Eagle Mine Superfund site and began work to clean up the area. The organization finished their work in 2000, but what's left of the once great mining town remains inaccessible to this day. Ani was a medieval city that developed in the northeastern corner of Turkey on the Armenian border in the 5th century. Because of its location, very close to both a popular caravan route and a sizable river, the Armenian king Ashat the Merciful decided to make Ani his capital city. Beautiful churches with some of the finest architecture of the medieval era turned Ani into a truly gorgeous location. By the 11th century, as many as 100,000 people may have lived within Ani's walls. Mongol hordes laid waste to Ani throughout the 1200s, but the formerly stunning city suffered the far nastier wrath of nature when an earthquake leveled many of its structures in 1319. These disasters forced the capital into a period of sharp decline, and shifting trading routes eventually exacerbated those issues. By the 18th century, the city was empty, but many of the elements of its former beauty still remain. UNESCO recognizes Ani as an archaeological site that attracts tourists from around the world.